Nationwide demonstrations. Dozens of protesters killed. Allegations of police brutality. A state of emergency. And a president clinging to power. This is the scene in Sudan today. For months, thousands of demonstrators have taken to the streets to demand that President Omar al-Bashir step down. The protests began in December 2018 in the city of Atbara. The sudden tripling of the cost of bread sparked the initial protests, but they quickly turned into anti-government rallies calling for the resignation of al-Bashir. The uprisings serve as a continuation of the 2013 anti-government protests, in which dozens were killed. In recent demonstrations, unarmed protesters have been met with live ammunition and tear gas by government forces. According to rights groups, at least 51 people have been killed, hundreds injured, and thousands jailed. Demonstrators say they want a revolution.
تعبنا من الحالة الماشية من سيء لأسوأ دي، تعبنا من المعاناة مع النظام ده كل يوم، تعبنا من الدكتاتورية دي، عايزينهم يتخارجوا وخلاص.
Since its independence in 1956, Sudan has had two revolutions, in 1964 and 1985. In both cases, mass protests overthrew military dictatorships and replaced them with civilian governments. But the process of democratization was always hindered by the same cycle of military intervention.
The key issues of debate in Sudan since independence have been the struggle for a permanent constitution and what role Islam would play in that constitution, a struggle over identity, how Sudanese perceive themselves, whether they are Arab, whether they African, or could they come to a different formula that guides what kind of domestic and foreign policies the state would take. The debate has been over, should there be a central government, should there be a federal government, what kind of freedom should the different regions have to govern themselves.
Al-Bashir came to power in 1989 when he led a coup orchestrated by the National Islamic Front and its leader, Hassan al-Turabi. Omar al-Bashir has been accused of intensifying existing issues of armed conflict, corruption, and an economic crisis. In the western region of Darfur, an armed conflict between rebels and government forces started in 2003. It began due to the alleged discrimination against the region and its non-Arab population. An estimated 300,000 people were killed and 3 million displaced in what the UN describes as a human catastrophe. The ICC accused al-Bashir of orchestrating genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in the region, and called for his arrest in 2009 and 2010. Al-Bashir also presided over a country torn apart by a decades-old civil war between North and South. 2 million people died as a result of war, famine, and disease caused by the conflict, mostly Southerners. A 2005 comprehensive peace agreement gave the South autonomy and laid the groundwork for a 2011 independence referendum. The South voted in January, and by July 2011, the Republic of South Sudan was declared. Shortly after the split, the Nuba Mountains and Blue Nile regions, which mostly identified with and fought alongside the South for their independence, started another revolt against the government when they were prevented from seceding with South Sudan. The government was accused of responding with attacks against civilians, indiscriminate aerial bombardments, and the blocking of aid, causing a humanitarian crisis. In addition to the deadly conflicts, Sudan has seen corruption on all levels of the government. NGOs report that the government is believed to have embezzled up to $9 billion in oil revenues.
Sudan, by many international measures, is a country where corruption is widespread. The ability to advance oneself economically in Sudan is difficult unless one has ties to the ruling party. And that just creates a system that trickles down from the highest to lower levels. One sees one's advancement only through corrupt means, bribery, the acquisition of bids for projects through backdoors and so forth.
Sudan is rich with natural resources such as oil, gold, cotton, sorghum, and more.
Agriculture was the leading economic engine, employing 80% of the labor force. But due to mismanagement, the country's agricultural sector collapsed. And when the South gained its independence, it took 3/4 of Sudan's oil resources along with it.
Inflation rates have reached 72%, and the country's living conditions are worsening. The economy was crippled further by the impact of U.S. sanctions, which were imposed between 1997 and 2017. Streets are filled with lines due to shortages at banks, gas stations, bakeries, and pharmacies, fueling growing frustrations against the government. The deteriorating situation has led people across the nation to take to the streets and demand change. The protests quickly turned into anti-government rallies. Government forces responded with a heavy crackdown. There have been allegations of sexual assault and torture of protesters while in custody, which the government has denied. Al-Bashir has refused to step down, saying the protesters don't represent the majority. At the same time, he called on Parliament to postpone constitutional amendments that would allow him to run for another term in the 2020 elections. A state of emergency was declared in February 2019. He also dissolved the national and state governments, reshuffled the cabinet, and appointed new state governors, all of whom belonged to the military and security forces.
The hope of the umbrella group organizing these protests, the Sudanese Professional Association, was that the army would at some point step in to remove Bashir from power. In my opinion, it is unlikely to happen because Bashir knew exactly how to minimize the chances of that scenario by declaring a state of emergency, by appointing the top army brass, i.e. the people you would be worried about to stage a coup, as state governors, thus turning his regime into a fully militarized one and sidelining the civilian components of his regime, the National Congress Party.
Protesters have rejected al-Bashir's promises of reform and refused to leave the streets.
Despite several internet and social media blackouts, people are still using social networks to plan demonstrations and share footage.
The protests are mainly led by the youth and have included different civil society groups such as doctors, university students, journalists, women's rights activists, and more. In some cases, the military has stepped in to protect the protesters from other security forces trying to disperse them.
The slogan, "We are all Darfur," that came in the first few weeks of the protest, rejecting the allegation by the government that Darfuri students linked to one of the Darfur rebel groups were behind the protest. I think that in itself is a major shift in the collective consciousness of Sudan. Also, the important role that women have played in these protests. It shows you also a kind of qualitative shift in how society is organizing politically. I think at minimum, what we can say what these protests have achieved is a major shift in the consciousness of Sudanese.
This includes the Sudanese diaspora. Tazgut bas is what they're chanting, which means just fall. They're also calling for freedom, peace, and justice.
Opposition groups have urged the government to step down and allow for a 4-year transitional period, followed by elections. But the government is refusing to budge. So the protests continue.